The morning Edmund Whitfield died, his daughter was on her knees in the dirt. Clara had been working in the southwest corner since before sunrise, her fingers moving through the soil with the kind of muscle memory that bypasses thought entirely. She was checking root moisture, pressing her palm flat against the earth, the way her father had taught her when she was small enough to walk between the rows without ducking. The soil was dark, almost black in the early light, and it crumbled with a richness that felt like a promise the farm hadn't been keeping lately. She noticed, not for the first time, that the blueberry bushes here at the far edge of the property looked different from the ones closer to the house. Fuller. The branches bent slightly under the weight of fruit clusters that were simply denser than anything she saw in the center fields. She had noticed this before. Her father had noticed it too. Neither of them had ever stopped long enough to ask why. The sound of tires on gravel reached her before she saw the car. She knew the sound of every vehicle that had a reason to turn onto Whitfield Farm, and this one was unfamiliar, slower, more deliberate, like whoever was driving wasn't sure they had the right address. She stood, brushed the soil from her knees, and looked back toward the house. The white sedan with the small county medical insignia on the door was already parked beside the porch. Dr. Hargrove was climbing the front steps. Clara did not run. She stood between the rows of blueberry bushes and looked at her hands for a long moment, the soil still dark in the lines of her palms. Her father's soil, 30 acres of it, surrounding her on every side. Then she walked toward the house. Not fast, not slow. The way you walk when your body already knows something your mind isn't ready to hold. Edmund Whitfield had been sick for 14 months, though he refused to call it that. He called it tired. He called it his back acting up. He called it the kind of thing that passes when you get enough sleep. And he said this while sleeping fewer hours each week, rising earlier each morning, as though trying to outwork whatever was coming for him. His hands had remained strong, even as the rest of him diminished, and Clara had taken some private comfort in that. Men like Edmund, men who had given themselves entirely to land and labor their hands, were the last thing to go. He was 61 years old. He had farmed the same 30 acres his own father had planted, and he had kept meticulous records of every season across 3 decades. He had loved Clara's mother with a quiet constancy that required no announcement, and when her mother passed during Clara's 16th year, Edmund had simply kept going. He cooked breakfast every morning. He kept the house clean. He maintained the same daily rhythms as if grief were just another season to be worked through. Clara had inherited his stubbornness without understanding, until much later that stubbornness in the right soil grows into something closer to endurance. She did not cry at the funeral. She stood beside the grave in the small cemetery behind the Presbyterian church on Millfield Road, and she held herself very still while neighbors she had known her entire life said the kinds of things people say at gravesides. She thanked them. She shook their hands. She accepted the casseroles that began arriving at the front door the following morning, and she stacked them in the refrigerator in careful rows, and she did not eat any of them. On the 4th night after the burial, she sat down at her father's roll-top desk. She had avoided it until then, not from grief exactly, but from something more practical. She had sensed that once she opened those drawers and confronted the true state of things, the quiet holding pattern she'd been maintaining would crack open into something she'd have to act on. Edmund had never discussed the finances with her in any direct way. He was from a generation that treated debt as a private shame, something to be managed and minimized, and never spread around. But Clara had seen the way he studied the mail each evening with his reading glasses pushed to the end of his nose, his jaw held in a particular set that meant the numbers weren't cooperating. The desk had 5 drawers. The right side bottom drawer held the ledgers, 6 of them, cloth-bound, one for each of the last 6 years, and behind the ledgers, stacked in chronological order, going back to 1941, were the journals. 30 years of Edmund Whitfield's observations written in his careful cursive, filling 5 leather-bound notebooks that smelled of dust and lanolin. She pulled the most recent one first and opened it on the desk, and she read until the lamp oil burned low, and then she refilled it and kept reading. Her father had been a more precise observer than she had ever fully appreciated. He recorded everything: dawn temperatures, soil moisture estimates, the arrival date of the first blossoms each year noted to the exact day, the condition of Boggs's hives when they arrived, and they arrived every year. Harlan Boggs and his gray-weathered boxes, dependable as tax season and nearly as welcome. Edmund had written Boggs' hives came in on April 9th. Bees seemed listless. Cold snap 2 days ago may have affected them. We'll watch, he had written in a later entry, pollination coverage uneven again this year. Center rows worst. Southwest corner better as usual. Perhaps the slope improves drainage there. Perhaps the soil composition differs. Have not investigated further. Clara set the journal down. She picked up the one before it, found the same observation 3 years earlier, worded differently, but meaning the same thing. The southwest corner outperformed. No explanation pursued. She pulled the oldest journal from the stack, the one that began in 1941, and turned to the early entries when her grandfather had been the one writing. There it was in heavier ink and around her hand. The far west bushes always produce well. Clarence says it's the windbreak from the cedar trees. I am not certain. The soil there feels no different to my hand. 30 years, 3 generations of Whitfield men noting the same anomaly, attributing it to slope or soil or wind, and then moving on to the next task, because there was always a next task, always something more immediate demanding attention. Clara closed the journal. She walked to the window above the desk and looked out into the dark. The farm was invisible in the moonless night, but she knew exactly where everything was, could map it in her mind with the accuracy of someone who had walked every row since childhood. The southwest corner sat against the edge of the old-growth timber that bordered the property along its western boundary. The timber was not theirs, it belonged to the county technically, an old forest preserve that had never been logged, but it pushed right up to their fence line, a wall of Douglas fir and cedar, an Oregon white oak that had been standing since before her grandfather broke this ground. And in that timber, in the hollow trees and the rotting logs and the dense understory, native bees had been living undisturbed for as long as anyone could remember. Bumblebees, mason bees, small ground-nesting species whose names Clara didn't yet know. Every spring they emerged and worked the edge of the Whitfield property with a quiet consistency that no one had ever thought to credit. The southwest corner didn't outperform because of drainage. It outperformed because it had never actually depended on Harlan Boggs. She stood at that window for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass, the old timber breathed its slow breath, and the bees that lived in it slept their winter sleep, and 30 acres of blueberry bushes waited for the decisions that would determine whether they bloomed into abundance or into the quiet end of everything the Whitfield name had built. She went back to the ledgers. She didn't sleep. By morning, she had a clear picture of the farm's finances, and it was the picture of a patient in the later stages of something serious. The mortgage had been restructured twice. The equipment account was effectively empty. The pollination contract with Boggs Orchard Services represented the single largest operational expense after the mortgage payment itself. More than seeds, more than labor, more than the fuel that kept the tractor running. And the yields it supposedly enabled had been declining steadily for 8 years. A trend so gradual that each year's loss could be rationalized as weather or market fluctuation, never quite bad enough in isolation to force a reckoning, but devastating in aggregate. Clara made a column of numbers. Then she made another column beside it. She worked until the sun came through the kitchen window and the coffee she'd forgotten about went cold on the counter. Harlan Boggs arrived on a Friday morning, 9 days after the funeral. She heard his truck before she saw it. The diesel engine with its particular low grumble, the sound of it turning into her driveway, with the confidence of a man who had been turning into this driveway for 22 years and saw no reason that would change. He was a large man, Boggs, with a florid face that had been weathered into something that looked like authority, the permanent squint of someone accustomed to being listened to. He carried a clipboard as he always did, and he was already looking down at it as he climbed out of the cab, flipping to the Whitfield page before his boots had properly hit the gravel. Clara was on the porch. She had been there for 10 minutes, having heard his truck turn onto the county road well before it reached her property. She watched him approach with her arms crossed, not from hostility, but because the morning was cold and because she was holding herself in a particular way that she had been maintaining since the funeral. Upright, careful, nothing spilling. Boggs looked up from his clipboard. He registered her presence, her expression, the fact that she was standing rather than walking toward him, and he made a rapid series of adjustments that he probably wasn't aware of. His face arranged itself into something that was approximately sympathy. He slowed his walk by a half step. He said nothing about Edmund. He was not, Clara understood, a man who knew how to speak to grief. And he had apparently decided that proceeding as though things were normal was the most practical tribute he could offer. Clara, his voice had the particular timbre of a man who spoke mostly to other men. Time to get the season locked in. I've got more demand than capacity this year, so I'm asking folks to commit early. Same arrangement as before with a 5% adjustment for my costs. Clara looked past his shoulder for a moment toward the fields. The blueberry bushes stood in their rows, still bare, the buds just beginning to swell with the slow biological optimism of early spring. She had walked those rows every morning this week. She had counted the buds on the southwest corner bushes against the buds on the center row bushes and found no meaningful difference. The difference would come later in the fruit that set or didn't set, and she already knew which rows would tell which story. I won't be needing the hives this year, Mr. Boggs. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds, which felt considerably longer. Boggs blinked. His eyes moved to the driveway behind her, to the windows of the house, some unconscious search for a parent or a husband, or someone who might provide a more sensible explanation for what he just heard. You selling? The question landed with the particular flatness of someone who considers themselves a realist. Can't say I blame you, Clara. Your father fought this place for a long time. The math on a 30-acre operation gets hard. Clara kept her voice level, her chin steady. I'm not selling. Another silence. Shorter this time, filled with a recalibration she could almost hear happening behind his eyes. Then the smile arrived, not a cruel smile, nothing as deliberate as cruelty. It was the smile of a man confronted with a misunderstanding he found more amusing than threatening. Well now, what's the plan then? You going to pollinate 30 acres by hand? He said, sweetheart, next, not loudly, almost as an aside. The word dropping from his mouth with the casual ease of a habit he'd never once examined. Clara looked at him steadily. I have another plan. The smile broadened. He shifted his weight, planted his feet slightly wider, the body language of a man settling in to be entertained. He asked without malice what plan that might be. Clara said nothing further. She had learned from her father that silence deployed at the right moment cost nothing and communicated everything. Boggs waited. When nothing came, he laughed, a short, genuine sound, not performed, the laugh of someone who has genuinely heard something that struck him as absurd. He slapped the side of his truck, the sound cracking across the quiet morning. He got in. The springs complained under his weight. He rolled down the window as he backed out, and he called across the widening distance. Don't wait too long to call me, Clara. My schedule fills up fast. Then he was gone. The diesel grumble fading down toward the county road, and the morning settled back into its quiet, and Clara stood on the porch and looked at the far edge of her property, where the timber line began dark and dense against the pale spring sky. She had 1 week before the blossoms opened, maybe 10 days if the temperature stayed cool. She went inside and called the bank. The conversation with the loan officer, a man named Prescott, who had dealt with Edmund for 15 years and who spoke to Clara with the careful gentleness of someone handling something fragile, confirmed what the ledgers had already told her. The farm was not in immediate foreclosure, but the margin was thin, the runway was short, and any season that failed to post at least a moderate improvement in yield would accelerate a conversation that everyone involved would prefer to avoid. Prescott said your father was a good man twice during the call. Clara thanked him both times. When she hung up the phone, she sat in Edmund's chair for a moment with her hand still on the receiver, looking at the wall where his hat still hung on its hook by the back door. The combine was in the barn. It had always been there, at least in Clara's conscious memory, though her grandfather had bought it under different assumptions about the future of this farm. It was an Alice Chalmers red of the vintage that had seemed modern in its time, now squatting under a tarpaulin in the back corner of the barn like an embarrassing secret. Edmund had used it 3 times in 20 years, each time optimistically, each time producing a result that didn't quite justify the dream. After the 3rd attempt, he had covered it with the tarp and not spoken of it again. Clara had occasionally heard men at the Grange Hall mention it. Arthur's got that old Alice sitting out there, shamed to let a machine like that rust, and each time she noticed her father's jaw set in that particular way. It was by any reasonable assessment the most valuable single asset on the property. She made 4 phone calls over 2 days. The first 3 yielded nothing useful. The 4th connected her with a man named Herschel Davies from Polk County, who had been looking for exactly this make and model for a grain operation he was expanding. Davies had a flat, practical voice, and he asked precise questions about the machine's condition that Clara answered as accurately as she could. He drove out the following Tuesday, walked around the combine, twice climbed up into the cab, started the engine, listened to it, run for 3 minutes, then climbed back down. He offered her a figure that was below what the machine was worth and above what she had feared he might offer. She accepted without countering. Davies looked mildly surprised, the expression of a man who had prepared himself for negotiation and found himself facing something different. He wrote the check, they shook hands, and he brought his own flatbed 2 days later and took the combine away. By the time the Alice Chalmers had cleared the end of the driveway, word was already moving through the valley. Clifford Sutton's wife had seen the flatbed pass their place. By evening, Clifford had mentioned it to 3 men at the feed store. The story assembled itself without Clara's participation. Arthur Whitfield's daughter was liquidating. The old combine gone, probably the tractor, next maybe the farm itself before summer. People shook their heads with the comfortable sadness reserved for outcomes they had seen coming. Harlan Boggs, when the news reached him, reportedly nodded and said nothing. He had been in this business long enough to recognize the particular trajectory. Nobody wondered where the money was going. Nobody considered any alternative interpretation. Clara drove south the following morning before the valley had fully woken up. She had spent 3 evenings on the phone, working her way through a list of names that had come from the County Agricultural Extension Office, from a copy of the American Bee Journal she'd found in the library in Salem, from a conversation with the librarian there, who had been more helpful than anyone she'd spoken to in the previous 2 weeks. Most of the names on her list had nothing available too early in the season, already committed, couldn't spare Colonies. 2 had availability but gave her a feeling she didn't trust when she spoke with them, some quality in their voices that suggested the bees were secondary to the transaction. The last name on the list was Augustus Mabry, and when she called him, she got a voice that she initially thought was a recording. It was so unhurried. He asked her 3 questions. How much land? What crop? Had she kept bees before? She answered honestly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said to come down Saturday morning and she should bring her questions. The drive took her through the Willamette Valley in its spring state, the hills soft with new green, the air moving through her open window with the clean, cold clarity of a season that hadn't yet been complicated by heat. She drove through Salem, then south and east on 2-lane roads that became progressively smaller until she turned onto a gravel track indicated by a mailbox with no name, just the number painted on in white. The track ran between 2 rows of old filbert trees and opened into a property that was, she realized immediately, one of the most deliberately designed pieces of land she had ever seen. Not beautiful in any decorative sense. Functional. Every element of it arranged to serve a specific purpose, and every purpose serving something larger. She sat in her car for a moment before getting out, just looking. Gus Mabry was already walking toward her from the direction of a long, low structure she would later understand was one of his honey houses. He was older than she had expected, a man somewhere in his middle 70s, she guessed, with a face so weathered it had moved past looking aged into something that seemed almost geological. His eyes were extraordinarily clear. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had stopped wasting motion long ago. He looked at her for a moment the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand rather than simply assess. He did not offer condolences, for Edmund did not seem to know or care that she was recently bereaved, which Clara found more respectful than the alternative. You drove 2 hours, he said, not a question. I have specific needs, Clara answered. They walked together through his operation for the better part of an hour. He showed her the colonies he had available, 20 of them, Italian honeybees in Langstroth hives that had been managed through the previous season with the kind of attentiveness that showed in every measurable indicator of hive health. He showed her the frames without her asking, pulling them with bare hands and holding them up to the light. The bees moved on the comb with a steady, purposeful activity that she was beginning to learn meant something specific, though she couldn't yet have said what it meant precisely. She noticed that they did not alarm at the intrusion. The hive had a smell warm and complex, somewhere between candle wax and the inside of a flower. She filed this away. Gus watched her watch the bees, and she had the sense that he was running some private assessment she was not privy to. He hadn't offered her a price yet. He hadn't talked about himself, his experience, his years in the business, any of the things that Clara had encountered in the other calls she'd made. He just showed her things and watched what she did with what she saw. That's a significant investment for someone who's never kept bees, Gus said. They were standing by a row of hives along his eastern fence line, the morning warming slightly, the bees beginning to traffic in and out of the entrances in increasing numbers. Clara looked at the hives. It's not an investment in bees, it's an investment in what the bees will do. She paused. My father kept records for 30 years. I spent a week reading them. There's a pattern he never explained, and I think I know what explains it. Gus turned to look at her directly for the first time. He had the eyes of someone who had been lied to enough times to have developed an excellent instrument for detecting the absence of it. She told him about the southwest corner, about 15 years of notations in Edmund's careful hand, about the timberline, the native habitat, the bees that had been working the edge of her property free of charge and without acknowledgement for decades. She told him that she had sold the combine. She told him what she intended to do with those 20 colonies where she intended to place them. How she had already identified 4 sheltered positions on the property based on wind patterns she had mapped from her father's weather records. When she finished, Gus was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he turned back toward the barn and said over his shoulder to follow him. He gave her a price that was fair. He went over the basics of hive management inspections, spacing water sources, what to watch for, with the economy of someone who has explained things many times and has learned to trust that people either absorb the essential information or they don't. And there's no additional explaining that changes which category they fall into. He answered her questions without embellishment. When she asked something he thought revealed a misconception, he corrected it directly without softening. Before she left, he went back into the honey house and came out with something she hadn't expected, a small composition notebook, the cover soft with age, the pages dense with handwriting that had evolved over what appeared to be decades. He held it out to her. I've been meaning to write a proper manual, he said. Haven't gotten around to it. This is what I have instead. You can keep it. I know what's in it. Clara looked down at the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was younger, more angular. The letters smaller than the handwriting toward the end. 40 years of someone learning condensed into a thing she could hold in one hand. She looked up. Why are you giving me this? Gus seemed to think about whether to answer, then decided, your bees will teach you more than I can, but it helps to know what questions to ask. He paused for just a moment, something behind his eyes assessing something. Your father ever keep records? Yes, Clara said. He nodded once as if that settled something. Then you're already ahead of most. She drove back north with 20 hives scheduled for delivery the following Thursday. A notebook she read at every red light, and the particular feeling in her chest of someone who is committed to something that cannot be uncommitted to. The money was spent. There was no combine to sell back. The decision existed now in the category of things that simply had to be seen through. The hives arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks before the blossoms were expected to open. Gus Mabry drove them himself, which Clara had not expected. He backed his truck down the farm's main access road with the skill of someone who had done this maneuver in tighter spaces, and the two of them spent 4 hours placing the hives in the 4 positions Clara had selected. She had been specific about those positions based on the wind patterns in her father's records, sheltered from the northwest exposure that brought the worst of the coastal storms oriented toward the morning sun. Positioned so that the bee flight paths would intersect with the maximum number of blossoms across as many different rows as possible. Gus looked at the positioning without comment and helped her set each hive on its stand, adjusting the angle of one without being asked. When the last hive was down and the two of them stood back from it, the combined sound of 20 colonies beginning to orient themselves to a new location rose over the property with a fullness that Clara felt in her sternum as much as her ears. It was not loud. It was pervasive. It spread through the rows of blueberry bushes and rose toward the line of firs at the property's edge and simply occupied the air in a way that she could not immediately find words for. Clifford Sutton saw the truck from his property line. He had been moving irrigation equipment along his western fence line when the unfamiliar vehicle came in, and he had watched the process. The careful unloading the white suits, the wooden boxes being positioned around the Whitfield property with what struck him as unusual deliberateness, with the attention of a man who had farmed next to this land for 23 years. He did not come over. He watched from his side of the fence with his arms resting on the top rail and his jaw working slowly on something. His wife, Millicent, watching from their kitchen window, saw the expression on her husband's face and said nothing. By the time Gus Mabry's truck was back out on the county road, Clifford Sutton had already turned back to his own work. But at supper that evening, eating the pot roast Millicent had made, he told her what he'd seen. His voice had the particular flatness of someone rendering a verdict. Arthur Whitfield's girl just traded a combine for a hobby. He said it without cruelty, without any particular investment. It was simply the shape of the thing as he understood it. Millicent said nothing. She passed him the bread. The story reached the Grange Hall the following Tuesday. By then it had acquired the minor embellishments that stories acquire in transit. The combine had been sold for far less than it was worth. Clara had bought more hives than anyone could possibly need. She had been seen talking to the bees. She had declined Boggs's contract in a manner that some reported as rude and others as simply strange. The men at the Grange Hall were not unkind people. They were practical people, and they expressed their concern for Clara Whitfield's situation in the way practical people do, which is by diagnosing the problem accurately and offering no solution because they had already determined the outcome. Chester Aldridge, who was the closest thing the Willamette Valley had to an elder statesman of agriculture, 61 years old, 100 acres of apple orchards, a manner that carried the authority of someone who had been right often enough to have earned it, listened to the account of Clara's hives with his arms folded and his head tilted slightly the way he listened to all information he was deciding what to do with. When he spoke, he said only, "She's Edmund's daughter. She's not stupid." He said it without enthusiasm, the way a man states a fact he finds inconvenient. Nobody took this as endorsement. Nobody was meant to. At the feed store on the Friday of that week, Clifford Sutton allowed that he had a standing offer to help a fellow farmer if things got difficult, by which he meant he would inform Clara when it was time to call Boggs, in case she had lost track of that option. He said this to three men who nodded with the gravity of people doing community service. Harlan Boggs heard the full account secondhand by the weekend. He was at a county agricultural meeting in Salem, the kind of quarterly gathering where the business was contracts and the real currency was the social architecture of who deferred to whom. Someone mentioned Clara Whitfield. Someone repeated what she'd done. Boggs listened without expression until they finished, then set his coffee cup down. "She'll call me by May." He said it with the certainty of a man stating a physical law. Then he moved on to something else. Clara did not attend the Grange Hall meeting. She did not go to the feed store that week. She was on her property every morning before dawn and most evenings until full dark, learning 20 hives, the only way that hives can be learned by proximity, by repetition, by being present enough for long enough that the patterns begin to become legible. She read Gus Mabry's notebook by lantern light each night, not from start to finish, but intuitively opening to passages that felt relevant to what she had observed that day. His handwriting was a secondary teacher, the earlier entries more tentative, the later ones moving with the confidence of someone who had stopped guessing. She began to understand what she was hearing in the drone of the colonies, the difference between a hive operating at full productive capacity and one that was moving toward a problem. She began to understand the smell of a healthy hive, that warm, specific fragrance of wax and curing nectar that she started thinking of as the smell of a working system. On the evening of April 14th, with the blossoms still 8 days from opening, and the air holding the particular charged stillness of a spring that was deciding what to do next, Clara sat on the upturned crate she'd been using as a seat near the apiary in the southwest corner of her property. The hive nearest to her was active even in the cooling evening, bees moving in and out at a slower pace than midday, but still engaged in the constant maintenance that she was learning never truly stopped. She had Edmund's most recent journal in her lap. She opened it to the first blank page, found her pen, and wrote the date at the top. She sat for a moment looking at what she'd written, then at the hive in front of her, the fading light making the wood a deep amber, the activity at the entrance, a quiet, steady thing she could almost feel as a vibration through the soles of her boots. She wrote April 14th, 1971. The bees are home. She closed the journal and sat in the gathering dark while 20 colonies settled into their first night on Whitfield land, their combined hum low and constant and present in the way that only living things can be present, not just existing in a place, but inhabiting it, staking some cellular claim to it, beginning the slow, irreversible process of belonging. The timber at the western edge of the property stood black against the last of the light. The blueberry rows ran away from her in their orderly lines, the buds at their tips swelling with the patient certainty of things that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to keep doing it. All of it, the trees, the rows, the 20 hives, breathing their steady breath. The soil beneath her feet that held 30 years of her father's attention held itself very still, as if the valley itself was waiting to see what this particular decision would become. Clara sat with it. She was 25 years old, and she had spent her last resource, and she had done something the entire community around her had already categorized as failure. She was not fearless. She was afraid in the particular way of someone who has committed too fully to turn back afraid in a way that had no useful outlet because the only direction was forward. But underneath the fear, quiet and deep and more enduring than the fear, was something she recognized from her father's journals, from the quality of attention she had seen him give to this land across 30 years of mornings. Call it faith in evidence. Call it trust in patterns that had been running longer than anyone had been paying attention. Call it the thing that keeps a farmer farming when the numbers say stop. The first bee found its way home in the dark, navigating by some instrument she didn't fully understand, landing at the entrance of its hive with a precision that had no doubt in it at all. She watched it disappear inside. She got up, tucked the journal under her arm, and walked back toward the house through the dark rows of her father's land, which was now her land, which was now also theirs. The first time Clara opened a hive without smoke, she understood immediately why beekeepers used it. She had read the relevant pages in Gus Mabry's notebook twice. She understood the principle smoke triggers a feeding response, convinces the colony that fire is nearby, that they may need to relocate, and a bee filling itself with honey. In preparation for flight is a bee too occupied to sting. She understood this intellectually, the way you can understand the temperature of a flame before you touch it. The understanding did not prepare her for the sound that rose from the box when she lifted the cover without the smoker she'd left back at the house. A shift in the colony's pitch that moved from the low working drone she had been learning to read into something higher faster, with an urgency in it that she felt against the back of her neck before she felt it anywhere else. 43 stings by her count afterward. Her left hand swelled to nearly double its size by evening, the fingers stiff, the knuckles invisible beneath the fluid that gathered there, with a determination that seemed almost punitive. She sat at the kitchen table with her hand in a bowl of cold water and Gus Mabry's notebook open in front of her, reading the passage on protective equipment with the focused attention of someone who has recently received instruction in a very physical form. She went back the next morning with the smoker properly loaded and properly lit. The learning had a specific texture. It was not the gradual, comfortable accumulation of knowledge she associated with books, the way information layers itself neatly onto prior information, each new fact slotting into an existing framework. This was more like learning a language by immersion, the comprehension arriving not through explanation, but through repeated exposure until patterns begin to surface on their own. She learned to read the frames, the difference between capped honey and capped brood, the particular pearlescent quality of royal jelly in an open cell, the precise way a laying queen moved through a frame, the slight parting of bees around her, a small sovereignty in motion. She learned to identify a healthy population by its smell, the temperature, the way the colony responded when she moved slowly, versus when she moved with any trace of urgency. The queen she killed by accident was in the 4th hive on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of April. She was inspecting frames for the first time without referencing the notebook every few minutes, moving with what she had mistaken for growing competence. The frame slipped slightly as she was setting it back into the box. A small thing, a half-inch miscalculation, and the queen happened to be traversing the precise section of comb that met the frame's edge. She didn't know immediately. She finished the inspection, replaced the cover, moved to the next hive. It was the sound that told her something was wrong when she passed hive 4. Again an hour later, a high, thin quality to the colony's voice, different from anything she had yet cataloged in her developing vocabulary of hive sounds. She called Gus Mabry from the kitchen. The phone cord stretched to its limit as she stood at the back window, watching the hive from across the distance of the yard. His voice came through the line with its characteristic economy. She described what she was hearing. He asked 2 questions, then, You've got a queenless hive. You need to get a replacement queen introduced within 48 hours, or you'll start losing the colony's cohesion. He told her exactly what to do. He stayed on the line while she went back out, one hand holding the receiver while the other took notes. Though she knew she'd have to set the phone down to actually perform the procedure. Before she did, he said something she wrote on the back of her hand because she had run out of paper. A colony without a queen doesn't die immediately. It loses its reason. The introduction of a replacement queen took 3 hours in a level of sustained delicacy that Clara had not previously associated with herself. The procedure involved a small cage, a candy plug that would dissolve over several days, allowing the colony time to acclimate to the new queen's pheromones rather than perceiving her as an intruder to be killed. She had to move slowly, more slowly than she had ever moved through any task in her life. And she had to override every instinct that said speed was efficiency. Speed here was catastrophe. The bees that found their way through the gaps in her veil and into the hair at the back of her neck were teaching her the same lesson from a different direction. She wrote in her journal that night, "Hive 4 has a new queen. I put her in myself. I have never in my life been so careful." She paused, then added, "Dad was careful like this. I understand now what it cost him. The hives along the northwest exposure were positioned wrong. She discovered this on a morning when the wind came hard off the coast, driving cold air across the property in long, sustained gusts that found every gap in every windbreak with the methodical efficiency of something looking for a weakness. She had placed 2 hives on the northwest side of the property based on her reading of the blueberry rose good positioning for blossom access, she had thought, but she had underweighted the wind exposure. And when she went out that morning, the bees from those 2 hives were not flying. They were clustered tight inside their boxes, conserving heat against a temperature drop that the wind had delivered without warning. The blossoms on the adjacent rows were opening the pale blue-white flowers, trembling in the gusts opening and closing with no visitors. It took her the better part of a day to move those 2 hives to a better position, a sheltered slot between the old equipment shed and a line of established cedars that broke the northwest wind effectively. She moved them in the early evening when the bees had returned from what little foraging the day had allowed, moving each box with the careful shuffling motion that Gus's notebook described, a few inches at a time over several minutes so as not to disorient the returning foragers entirely. Her back ached by the time the second hive was resettled, and she stood in the dim evening light looking at the 2 boxes in their new position with a mixture of exhaustion and something she was beginning to recognize as the specific satisfaction of a problem correctly solved rather than merely managed. She documented everything. Every morning and every evening, she wrote in the journal she had inherited from Edmund, or rather the journal she was creating inside the one he had left her. His notes on the right-hand pages, her notes on the left. A conversation across the border of death that she found she could sustain with a surprising absence of grief and a surprising abundance of actual dialogue. He would note a weather event. She would note how the bees had responded to the same weather pattern in a different year. He had been observing without knowing what he was observing. She was observing with the specific knowledge of what to look for, and the combination of their attentions produced something that neither alone could have generated. The blossoms opened on April 22nd. It happened over 2 days, a wave, moving from the southwest corner, always the southwest corner, outward through the rows, the pale flowers unfurling in the warming air, with the unhurried confidence of things whose timing is determined by forces too large to be argued with. Clara walked the rows on the morning of April 23rd, and the sound that surrounded her was unlike anything the property had produced during the 3 previous seasons she could remember clearly. The bees were out in numbers that seemed to exceed what she had calculated the 20 colonies could produce. Though she was still learning to estimate colony populations accurately, still recalibrating her sense of what 20 thriving hives actually represented in terms of working individuals. The blossoms were thick with visitors, each flower receiving multiple contacts in rapid succession. The pollen loads on the returning foragers, visible as bright yellow-orange masses on the corbiculae of their hind legs, packed tight, the color almost architectural against the dark fur of the bee's body. She stood in the middle of a row for 20 minutes that morning without moving. She was not conducting an inspection. She was simply present in the middle of what was happening, trying to hear it correctly, to hold the reality of it, without converting it prematurely into expectation. It was the 3rd week of May when Millicent Sutton came to the door. Clara heard the knock from the back of the house where she had been reviewing her weekly hive notes at the kitchen table. She was not expecting anyone, had not been expecting anyone, having learned in the weeks since the funeral that the people who had specific things to offer came without announcement. And the people who came to assess her situation typically found reasons to happen past on the road rather than making the full commitment of a proper visit. Millicent stood on the porch with a cloth-covered dish and the expression of a woman who had decided on something and was now executing it with the quiet resolution that Claire was beginning to understand was the particular competence of women who had spent decades living alongside loud opinions they had learned to work around. She was in her early 50s, Millicent, with gray, already well established in her dark hair, and hands that showed the same kind of work history as Clara's own. She came in and sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that were adjacent to what the visit was actually about. The blossoms, the unusually warm week, whether the old hardware store in town was really going to close as people were saying. Millicent asked how the bees were doing with the frank curiosity of someone who genuinely wanted to know, rather than someone managing a conversational transition. Clara told her about the queen she'd lost, the hive she'd repositioned, the difference between the sound of the property now and the sound of it when Boggs's rental hives arrived in previous years. Millicent listened with the full attention of someone who was hearing the actual content rather than sorting it into a pre-existing verdict. When Clara finished, Millicent looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then Clifford means well. She said it without apology, without softening, just as a piece of information that Clara might find useful. He doesn't know what to do when someone does something he doesn't have a category for. She paused for a breath, then looked up. Neither do most of the men around here. Don't let them be the measure of anything. Clara looked at her for a moment. She did not say thank you because the thing Millicent had offered didn't require thanks. It required acknowledgement. She nodded once, and Millicent nodded back, and the understanding between them settled into the space between their coffee cups without needing any further architecture. After Millicent left, Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the older woman's car back out of the drive and turn toward home. The afternoon light was long and gold across the property. In the nearest apiary, the late afternoon return traffic was at its peak, bees coming in from every direction with the directional certainty of commuters who know exactly which door is theirs. Clara was not alone. She had not fully understood until that moment how much she needed to know that. In the last week of April, Harlan Boggs' blue truck appeared at the end of the road. He did not turn in. He pulled up to the edge of Clara's property access where the county road met her driveway, and he sat there for a period that Clara estimated at 10 minutes, though she was watching from the east field, and her sense of time in that moment was not reliable. She could not see his face clearly at that distance, only the outline of him behind the glass, sitting very still with the engine running. He was looking at the apiary position, she realized. He was doing the math of 20 hives against 30 acres of blossoms, a calculation she suspected he had done before, but perhaps not with 20 healthy resident colonies as the variable. She continued her work. She did not wave. When she looked up again, the truck was gone, and the county road sat empty in the spring light, and the bees continued their work in the blossoms with the total indifference to audience of things engaged in something essential. The storm came on the 3rd of May. She knew it was coming. The morning had that specific quality of held breath that preceded the coastal systems, the air somehow both lighter and more dense, the birds behaving with the purposeful urgency of creatures who could read pressure gradients. She spent the daylight hours doing what she could, repositioning the water sources to more sheltered spots, checking the hive anchoring, adding extra weight to the covers of the most exposed boxes. She pulled out Gus Mabry's notebook and read his section on storm preparation twice, learning that the primary risk was not the hives overturning. A properly weighted hive on a properly leveled stand was more stable than it looked, but the cold and wet that could follow a severe system if colonies had burned through their honey stores during the initial cluster. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full. The wind came in sustained walls rather than gusts, and the rain that followed it was not the gentle Oregon drizzle that nourished without alarming, but the hard coastal variety that came in horizontally, finding the gap between the barn siding and the roofline, pushing through the weather stripping around the back door, running under the threshold in thin, determined lines. The oak tree at the northwest corner of the house moved in ways that oak trees were not supposed to move. Clara lay in her father's bed and listened to the housework against the wind. She had moved into his room 3 weeks earlier, not from sentiment, but from practicality. His room faced south, giving her the best view of the property in the mornings when she made her first assessment of the day. She had not changed much in the room. His work coat still hung on the hook behind the door. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, though she had moved them slightly to make room for her own journal. She lay in the dark and she listened to the storm, and the voices came. Not voices exactly. The accumulated weight of every judgment that had been passed on her since April arriving, now in the amplified dark of a serious weather event, with the particular cruelty of doubt, which is that it arrives in your own voice, indistinguishable from reason. She thought about the money, its entire weight transferred in a single transaction into 20 boxes sitting in the dark, in the rain. She thought about Prescott at the bank, his careful gentleness. She thought about Clifford Sutton's certainty, its absolute ease, the way a man could be that sure of something without appearing to have thought about it much. She reached for the journal she kept on Edmund's nightstand. She did not open her own pages. She turned to his navigating by memory to the section from 2 years prior. May of 1969. A storm she remembered clearly because it had come during the first week of Boggs' hives being on the property. She found the entry. His handwriting was steady even then, though she could see in retrospect the slight heaviness of a man who was more tired than he was telling anyone. Storm last night, significant wind. Went to check Boggs' equipment this morning, 2 hives tipped covers off. Bees disoriented. Boggs won't be able to get out here for 4 days. Coverage will be lost for most of this week's peak bloom. Can't be helped. This is the arrangement. She read that last sentence 3 times. This is the arrangement. The quiet devastation of a man who had made his peace with a system that was failing him because he could not see the alternative. His problem had been 100 miles away, anchored to a contract and a schedule that were entirely outside his control. Hers was 200 yards from her back door. She got up. She put on her father's work coat over her nightgown, pulled her boots on at the back door, found the flashlight on the shelf above the mudroom bench. The rain hit her like something with intention when she pushed through the back door, and the wind took the sound of the house away, immediately replacing it with the sound of the storm in full register, the trees, the rain on the barn metal, the particular voice of moving air when nothing is impeding it. She walked with her head down the flashlight beam, cutting a small, useless path through the dark and the rain. The nearest apiary was in the southwest corner, the most sheltered position on the property, the cedars and the timberline breaking the worst of the northwest wind. She reached the first hive and put the flashlight between her knees, pressing both palms flat against the sides of the box, the way she had seen Gus do when he was assessing without opening. The vibration came through the wet wood and into her palms and up through her wrists with a steadiness that stopped her breath for a moment. Low, even, constant. The cluster inside 10,000 bees pressed together in a living sphere around their queen, generating heat through the vibration of their flight muscles without moving their wings. A biological furnace of extraordinary efficiency that had been running without interruption or instruction for as long as this species had existed on the continent. They were not in distress. They were not confused. They were not waiting for her to save them. They were simply doing what they had always known how to do in the dark and the rain, with the competence of creatures for whom this situation was not a crisis, but a condition to be managed. Clara stood with her palms against the hive and the rain running down the back of her father's coat, and something shifted in her understanding that she would spend the rest of her life finding language for. She had come out here to check on them, to protect them if protection was needed. What she found instead was a demonstration of a principle she had been moving toward without knowing it. The thing you are tending does not need you to rescue it. It needs you to understand it well enough to set the conditions for what it already knows how to do. She was not their owner. She had been trying to be their keeper. What they were showing her through wet wood on a stormy night in early May was the actual nature of the relationship. Stewardship ran in both directions. She kept the conditions. They kept themselves. Between those two responsibilities, something larger than either of them was made possible. She sat down in the mud with her back against the hive, the flashlight off the storm moving overhead in the dark. She cried without making much sound, the kind of crying that isn't about release, but about arrival. The recognition that you have reached a place you didn't know you were traveling toward. She cried for Edmund, for the 30 years of his careful attention that had been pointed at the right question without ever quite finding the form of it. She cried for the machine she had sold, for the weight of this decision, for the nights she had lain awake, conducting an internal trial with herself as both accused and prosecutor. She cried because she was 25 years old on her father's land in the dark and rain, and she was completely alone, and the thing she had put everything into was alive and warm and vibrating with competence through the wooden wall at her back. The storm ran its course through the night. Clara came back inside sometime before 3 in the morning, dried off, slept 4 hours. She was up before the light changed. She was in the southwest apiary when the dawn broke properly, and she was there when the first bees emerged from the hive nearest to her, a tentative initial forager, one bee testing the morning air for the signals that would determine whether conditions warranted flight. What that bee found was a valley washed clean and cold, the air after a heavy storm carrying a freshness that had a flavor to it, and blossoms on every Whitfield bush opening from the previous day's warmth, releasing their signals into the new air. The bee returned to the hive, performed its report in the darkness of the box, the waggle dance that translated distance and direction and desirability into the kinetic language that others could follow. Within 4 minutes, the entrance of the hive was active in a way that Clara had not yet seen in the weeks of her observation. Not the steady traffic of a productive day. Something with more urgency in it, more density. The bees piling out over each other in a tumbling eagerness that had nothing tentative about it. Then the next hive, then the one beyond it. The sound built the way a river rises, not dramatically but inexorably, each hive contributing its voice to a collective register that spread across the property and rose toward the timberline and out over the blueberry rows and into the air above the Willamette Valley, with a fullness that Clara had no prior reference for, because she had never heard this particular thing before. Nobody in this valley had heard it for a very long time. This was not the thin, temporary industry of a few thousand rented workers completing their contracted obligation. This was a million resident bees committed to this piece of ground by the fact of their queens being here, their stores being here, their entire understanding of home being concentrated in this specific 30 acres. They were not doing their minimum. They were not conserving energy for the next job. There was no next job. This was home. They were working it the way living things work, the place where they actually belong. Clifford Sutton was running his tractor out toward his irrigation lines before 6 that morning, standard practice after a heavy storm assessing drainage. His route took him along the western edge of his property, which ran parallel to the Whitfield fence line. He slowed the tractor without making a conscious decision to slow it. The sound reached him through the tractor's engine noise, which meant it was considerable. He could see the Whitfield rows from here, the pale blossoms nodding in the early air. The movement over them, not wind movement, something more organized, more intentional. A shimmer of wings that covered every row he could see from where he sat, continuous, relentless, the blossoms receiving a density of visitors that made his apple orchards, even in their best years, look sparse by comparison. He sat on his tractor for longer than he could have accounted for if someone had asked him. He was not a sentimental man, not a man given to reconsidering things he had already filed away. What he was looking at was making reconsideration feel less like sentimentality and more like arithmetic. He drove on. He completed his irrigation assessment. He did not mention what he had seen to Millicent, who noticed his quiet at breakfast but said nothing. That evening at the Coopersmith Bar on the county road, where a certain constellation of valley farmers gathered on weeknights, someone asked Clifford whether the Whitfield place was still the topic it had been. Clifford turned his beer glass a quarter turn before answering. He said without particular emphasis, "She's got a lot of bees out there." Nobody pushed him for more, reading something in his tone that discouraged elaboration. 3 tables away, a man who knew Harlan Boggs repeated it to him the following morning. Boggs heard it. He said nothing. He filed it. The fruit set began revealing itself in the last week of May. Clara walked her rows every morning with the same systematic attention her father had applied to the same rows for 30 years. But she was looking for something specific now, counting the fruit clusters forming at each blossom site, running comparisons between rows, between sections of the property, between the data she was generating and the historical data in Edmund's journals that gave her a baseline for what normal looked like on this land. The southwest corner performed first, which she expected. What she did not expect was the magnitude. 5 clusters per blossom site. 6. On the strongest bushes in the southwest section, 7, the kind of fruit set that she had read about in the agricultural extension literature as a theoretical ceiling for optimum pollination, a number cited as an aspirational upper bound rather than a practical expectation. She made herself recount. She counted the same bushes 3 mornings in a row to rule out her own wishful mathematics. The numbers held. She moved to the center rows, the historical weakest section of the property, the area furthest from the timberline where the native bees had always underperformed the bog's colony's already inadequate coverage. The resident bees had worked these rows every day of the bloom without the radius limitation of a rental contract, without the orientation lag of colonies trucked in from somewhere else, without the lethargy of a population stressed by transit. The center rows were showing 4 and 5 clusters per site, numbers she had never seen in the center rows. She called Gus Mabry from the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon in late May. She read him her figures row by row from the northwest section through the center fields to the southwest corner. She read them in the flat factual voice of someone who has checked her methodology enough times to stand behind the numbers but cannot fully absorb what the numbers mean. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be informative. Then from 2 hours south, from a man who did not traffic in exaggeration, "Good Lord, girl." His voice carried something she had not heard in it before. Not surprise exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of someone who has been keeping score on a much longer timeline than the season. Clara set the phone down and sat in the kitchen while the late afternoon light moved across the floor in the slow diagonal that happened this time of year. Outside, across the rows of her father's land, 20 colonies were finishing their workday with the same unhurried certainty they brought to every hour of the bloom. The blossoms were nearly spent now, the flowers giving way to the swelling fruit that would be in the weeks ahead, the material evidence of everything that had happened here since April. She opened her journal. She wrote the fruit set numbers down, every row in careful columns the way Edmund had always organized his records. She dated the entry. She drew a simple diagram of the property with the yield distribution mapped across it. Then she wrote one sentence below the numbers, the kind of sentence that clarifies something you have understood in pieces for weeks, but not yet seen whole. The bees don't need to cover 30 acres. They need to live here. She looked at that sentence for a while. Outside, the colonies continued their evening wind down, the last foragers coming in, the guards taking their positions, the whole complex social organism of 20 hives reorganizing itself from its daytime mode into its nighttime mode with the practiced ease of long-running systems. The timber at the western edge stood in the evening shadow, the native bees already long settled into their hollow trees, in their ground nests, their work done for the day. Clara closed the journal, and for the first time since April the 14th, she felt something uncomplicated in her chest. Some knot that had been requiring constant attention, simply releasing the way a physical tension releases when the work that caused it is done. Not certainty, not safety. The harvest wasn't in yet, the money wasn't counted, the story wasn't over. But the land had given its early verdict, and the land she was learning did not speak imprecisely. She was 25 years old, and she was holding more promise per acre than any farm in the Willamette Valley. She went outside to walk the rows one more time in the dying light. The harvest crew arrived on a Monday morning in the third week of June, 7 people from the valley who had worked seasonal harvests on various properties for years. People whose hands knew the rhythm of picking before their minds were fully awake. Clara had hired them through the same informal network her father had always used. The same faces in some cases, men and women who had picked these rows before and carried their own memories of what the Whitfield yields had looked like in previous seasons. They did not say anything when they walked into the first row. Clara watched from the end of the row as they moved into position, each person finding their section, reaching for the first cluster, then stopping. Not all at once, not dramatically. One by one, in the small, private way of people who have just encountered something that doesn't match their expectations. She saw one of the older women, a picker named Darlene who had worked harvests in this valley for 15 years, turn a branch slightly in her hand, looking at the cluster from a different angle, as if the angle might explain the number of berries on it. Darlene looked down the row, then up at Clara, then back at the berries. She began picking without a word, but her pace was different from the start, faster, because there was more to pick, because the clusters were denser than anything her hands had been calibrated for. By mid-morning, the count had already exceeded the full-day projections Clara had built from her father's best historical yields. She recalculated twice, standing at the end of the center rows, with her notebook running the arithmetic against the weight tallies coming in from the weigh station she'd set up at the barn entrance. The numbers refused to become less extraordinary, no matter how many times she ran them. She called for a second load of crates before noon. The supplier was confused. She had ordered what had seemed at the time of ordering like a generous overestimate. She explained she needed twice the original quantity by Thursday. There was a pause on the line, the pause of someone adjusting their assumptions. She gave him the weight tallies from the morning. Another pause. He said he'd make it work. The berries themselves were the second revelation. Clara had known the fruit set was exceptional. She had counted clusters, measured circumference on sample berries across multiple rows, tracked the color development through the ripening weeks, with the same systematic attention she had been applying to everything on this farm since April. What she had not been able to fully anticipate, because no number captures, it was what those berries tasted like. She had been eating them during the morning inspection, the way anyone working a berry farm in harvest season eats berries without much deliberate attention. On the second day of picking, she stopped in the middle of a row, a single berry between her fingers, and actually paid attention. The sweetness was there, the expected sweetness of a ripe blueberry. But underneath it was something more complex, something with depth to it, a flavor that seemed to carry the specific character of the land it had come from. The dark Oregon soil, the Douglas fir pollen that the bees had worked alongside the blueberry blossoms, the particular mineral quality of the groundwater that fed the Whitfield property from the aquifer beneath the valley floor. This was not just a blueberry. It was a document. It was the record of a season conducted under specific conditions that could not be exactly replicated, which meant that what was in the crates loading onto the truck was not interchangeable with what came off other farms. It was particular. It was this place in this year under this arrangement. She ate 3 more berries and stood in the row for a moment with her face turned up toward the July sky. Then she went back to work. The total yield when the last crate was weighed and logged, and the final truck had pulled out of the driveway at the end of the second week of July, was a number that Clara wrote in her journal twice, once in the column format she used for data, once in a sentence spelled out because she needed to see it in 2 different forms to believe it was real. Per acre yield at nearly double the county average across the full 30 acres. In the southwest section, which had always been Edmond's anomalous outlier, the number approached 3 times the county average. The farm had not produced numbers like this in its recorded history. She filed the weight certificates. She received the payment from the cooperative where she sold the bulk of the crop. She sat with the number on the deposit receipt for a long time before she put it in the desk drawer. The honey operation had been invisible to everyone. This was partly by design. Clara had not announced it, had not discussed it with neighbors, had not mentioned it in the conversation she had with the harvest crew or the cooperative or Prescott at the bank when she had called in late June to give him a preliminary update on the season. The honey supers, the additional boxes she had added to 8 of the 20 hives in late May, once the colony populations had built to the point where surplus production was possible, had been filling quietly through the bloom and into the early summer, while everyone in the valley who was paying any attention to the Whitfield farm was focused on the blueberry rows. The bees were keeping 2 accounts simultaneously. Nobody had thought to check the second one. She extracted in the old barn on a Wednesday in mid-July, the day after the last berry crate went out. She had borrowed a hand extractor from a hobbyist beekeeper in the next county, a retired school teacher who had lent it without asking many questions, and she ran the equipment in the barn for 2 full days, working through the heavy supers frame by frame. The barn filled with a warmth and a scent that had no industrial equivalent, the smell of wax uncapping of honey at its moment of release. Something between a bakery and a garden in a summer afternoon, compressed into a single olfactory experience that she kept stopping to simply breathe. The honey was a color she had not expected. She had anticipated something in the standard amber range, the conventional color of commercial honey. What came off the Whitfield supers was a light clear gold, with the faintest suggestion of rose in it, when held up to the barn window, catching the afternoon light in a way that reminded her of something she thought about it for a while before identifying it: stained glass. The light through the honey had the quality of light through old church glass, colored not by pigment, but by something intrinsic to the material. She tasted it off the uncapping knife on the first day, and put the knife down and stood in the barn not moving for approximately 30 seconds. The flavor carried the blueberry blossoms as a primary note, but it was not simple, not sweet in a single register way. There was a floral complexity underneath the fruit note, something she eventually attributed to the wildflower borders she had allowed to grow along the property's fence lines. The clover, the Oregon grape, the wild asters that the bees had been working alongside the blueberries throughout the bloom. The honey was a record of everywhere the bees had gone, everything they had visited, the full geography of their foraging range, compressed into a substance that could be held in a jar and kept for years without losing its character. She poured it into 100 glass jars, working carefully, filling each one to a consistent level, wiping the threads clean before applying the lids. The labels she had ordered from a print shop in Salem arrived the day before the first farmer's market of July. Simple white rectangles, black text, Whitfield Farm, raw honey, Willamette Valley, Oregon. She had added one line beneath harvested from 30 acres of blueberry blossoms, 1971. The year mattered to her. She wanted the record to be complete. The Saturday farmers market in Corvallis ran from 7 in the morning until early afternoon, set up in the parking lot behind the county courthouse, with the particular organized chaos of a market that had outgrown its original footprint. Clara set up her table at 6:45, a folding table with a cloth, the 100 jars arranged in rows, 2 open jars with wooden tasting sticks beside a small sign that read, "Please taste." She had brought on an instinct she couldn't fully account for. A handful of the blueberries from the last picking arranged in a small bowl beside the honey jars to make the connection visible. The first customer came at 7:15. An older woman who tasted the honey from a stick looked at the jar, tasted again, then asked the price without setting the stick down. Clara told her. The woman bought 2 jars. The woman standing behind her had watched the exchange and stepped forward before Clara had finished making change. By 9 o'clock, 60 jars were gone. By 10:30, the table held 11 jars. A small group of people who had heard about the honey secondhand from someone who had been at the market earlier and called a friend arrived at 10:45. 4 of them. Clara sold 9 jars and turned the last 2 people away. She had brought a notepad acting on some premonition, and she wrote down the names and addresses of everyone who asked whether there would be more next week. She had 19 names on the list. The following Saturday, she brought 200 jars. She had worked every evening of the week to produce them, running the extractor through the remaining supers, filling and labeling with a systematic focus that left her tired in a way she hadn't felt since the early weeks of the hive establishment. She sold out before noon. The list of names waiting for next week's stock had grown to 31. When she sat with the honey revenue figures at the end of July, adding them to the blueberry figures she had already tallied, the combined number represented something that took a moment to register in full. The honey had not been planned as a primary income source. It had been a secondary consideration, a sensible use of colony capacity that would generate some additional income while the primary operation covered costs. What it had actually generated was closer to 40% of the blueberry revenue, a number so disproportionate to the space it occupied in her planning that she had to go back through the receipts twice to confirm the arithmetic. She had solved one problem. The solution had opened a second door she hadn't known was there. Chester Aldridge came to the fence line on an afternoon in late August. She knew his truck, the dark green Ford that was a fixture on the county roads, and she saw it slow as it passed her property and then pull over onto the shoulder near her western fence. She was in the southwest apiary finishing an inspection of the post-harvest hives, assessing colony strength for the winter preparation work she was already beginning to plan. She had seen the truck stop. She did not go to it. She completed the frame she was examining, replaced it, closed the hive, and then walked across the rows toward the fence line, where Chester Aldridge stood, with his arms resting on the top rail, looking at her blueberry bushes with an expression she could not immediately classify. He was a man who carried his authority in his posture, rather than his voice, the particular uprightness of someone who had been the person others listened to for so long that the position had become structural. He was 61, the same age Edmund would have been, a fact she was aware of as she crossed the rows toward him. The resemblance was not physical, but categorical. Men of that generation, of that specific relationship to this specific valley. She stopped on her side of the fence. The bushes between them were bare of fruit, Now the harvest long complete, but they were not the exhausted bare of a plant that had given everything it had and was now depleted. The leaves held a depth of green that she had been noticing for weeks, a color that spoke of root systems, not just surviving the season, but consolidating, drawing down the summer's energy into the wood and the soil for the winter ahead, building something. They looked, she thought, like plants that had been in a true partnership rather than a transaction. Chester Aldridge looked at them for a long moment before he spoke. When the words came, they came slowly as if he was committing to each one. Never seen bushes look that healthy after a harvest. He said it without the cadence of a compliment, without the social lubrication of someone trying to make a pleasant conversation. He said it as a piece of data that he was verifying against his own extensive records. Clara looked at the bushes. The bees did the work. She paused for a breath. They're good partners. He turned his eyes to the nearest apiary, the hives visible from where they stood settled and quiet in the late summer afternoon, with the reduced but steady traffic of a colony shifting out of the peak production mode into the preparation mode. His jaw moved slightly, the particular working of someone processing something that requires more time than the conversation is providing. How did you know? The question came out plainly without the defensive inflection of someone who has invested heavily in a different answer. It was a genuine question, the kind that costs something to ask. Clara reached into the pocket of her work jacket. She had taken to carrying one of Edmund's journals with her during the afternoon property walks, the fourth one, the one that covered 1960 through 1964, the one that contained the densest concentration of his southwest corner observations. She opened it to a page she knew well, now the entry from June of 1962, in which her father had written in his careful hand, "Southwest corner again outperforms. 38% above center rows by my estimate. Soil. Slope I cannot determine the cause. Will observe again next season." She held the open journal across the fence so Aldridge could read it. He looked at the page. His eyes moved across Edmund's handwriting slowly. He looked at the date. He looked at the entry below it from the same season which said much the same thing in fewer words. "My father knew," Clara said. "He just didn't know he knew." She let that sit for a moment. He was watching the right corner for 30 years. He recorded what he saw. He never made the connection to the timberline, to the native bees. She took the journal back. The answer was in his notes. "I just read them differently because I was looking for something he wasn't looking for yet." Chester Aldridge looked at the journal in her hands, then at the fence line, then at the timber that bordered the western edge of her property. She watched him trace the same connection she had traced on the night she stood at Edmund's desk window, the line from the timber to the native habitat to the southwest corner to 30 years of unexplained outperformance. She watched the moment it completed in his understanding. His face did not change dramatically. He was not a man whose face changed dramatically. But something settled in it, some previously held tension releasing. He did not apologize. She had not expected an apology from Chester Aldridge, would not have known what to do with one if it had come. What he offered instead was something more valuable from a man of his particular formation. He asked a real question, and he listened to the real answer, and when the answer landed, he let it land. He didn't argue with it. He didn't reframe it. He received it with the full weight of someone who understood what it meant to have been watching the wrong variable for a very long time. He straightened, lifted his arms from the fence rail. He looked at her directly for a moment, the look of someone recalibrating a measurement they had taken carelessly the first time. Then he got back in his truck. He drove away without another word, and the absence of a word was the most complete acknowledgement she had received from anyone in the valley since April. The question had been the concession. The silence after the answer was the respect. Harlan Boggs came at the end of August. She did not hear his truck this time. She was at the eastern end of the property working on the winterization of the farthest apiary, reducing entrance openings, checking the weight of the honey stores by lifting the backs of the hives, slightly making notes. When she came around the side of the equipment shed on her way back to the house, his truck was already parked at the edge of the driveway where the gravel met the grass. The engine off the cab empty. She found him standing at the edge of the first blueberry row, not inside it, At the edge of it, on the gravel path that bordered the planting, the way a person stands at the edge of something they are not certain they have permission to enter. He was not carrying a clipboard. This registered immediately the absence of it, because in 22 years of watching Harlan Boggs move through the world, the clipboard had been as constant as his shadow. Without it, he looked older, or perhaps more accurately, he looked his age. The florid authority of his face showing its foundation, the weathering more visible when not organized around a professional purpose. Clara stopped where she was perhaps 30 feet from him. She did not close the distance. She did not call out. She waited. He did not look at her for a while. He was looking at the rows at the bare of fruit bushes with their deep green post-harvest leaves at the hives visible from this angle, at two different positions on the property, at the strips of late-season wildflowers she had allowed to persist along the fence lines, in between the planted rows, clover asters goldenrod, the wild carrot that would set seed over winter and return in the spring without being planted again. He was looking at a farm that had been reorganized around a principle he had not previously encountered in this valley, and she could see in the stillness of him that he was performing some internal accounting that he had not anticipated needing to perform this season. He stood there for what she estimated at 15 minutes. He moved once, taking a few steps along the path to change his angle of view, looking at something in the hive nearest to him with a focused attention that she recognized as professional. The look of someone who kept bees or had kept them once and was assessing colony strength from the outside the way an experienced person learns to do. Then he walked back to his truck. He drove out to the county road without once looking in her direction. Clara stood where she was until the sound of his engine faded. Then she looked at the row he had been studying, the hives he had examined from a distance, the strips of wildflowers moving in the late summer air, the whole of it bathed in the long amber light of an August afternoon in the Willamette Valley. She tried to imagine what it had looked like to him, what the accounting had produced. He had built a business on a scarcity he helped maintain. If every farm in the valley established its own resident colonies, if every farm built the kind of integrated system she had built here, the demand for his service would not merely diminish. It would become irrelevant. He was standing at the edge of a demonstration of his own obsolescence, and he had come, she understood, not to contest it or to reconcile with her or to apologize for the spring. He had come to look at it directly. Some men, when they have been wrong about something large, need to see the evidence with their own eyes before they can begin to move past it. She went inside. She sat at Edmund's desk. She opened her journal to the current day's entry and wrote the sentence that had been forming in her mind since she watched his truck leave. He sold a product. I cultivated a system. The land always favors the system. In the years that followed, Harlan Boggs's truck was seen less frequently on the county roads of the Willamette Valley. His schedule, which had once been so full that he used the threat of its filling as a negotiating tool, developed gaps. The gaps widened. By 1976, Chester Aldridge had reduced his contract with Boggs Orchard Services by half. By 1978, Aldridge had 12 hives of his own, purchased through Gus Mabry, who had begun quietly routing inquiries from the Northern Valley to Clara for advice on placement and management. The Hendersons on Route 9 followed. The Bauer operation near Philomath began converting in 1979. None of them announced it as a movement. It accumulated the way understanding accumulates, one observation at a time, until the weight of observations exceeded the weight of the conventional answer. Boggs never came back to the Whitfield property. He never contacted Clara, never acknowledged the spring's conversation or its outcome. His absence became its own form of statement, louder as it extended. The last time Clara heard his name mentioned at any Valley gathering was in 1981, and it was mentioned in the past tense. The final accounting for the 1971 season happened on an October evening when the light came through the west window of Edmund's office at the low angle of autumn, the kind of light that finds the dust in the air and makes it visible. Clara had the ledger open on the desk, the full year's figures entered in the same column format her father had used. The same categories, the same careful handwriting she had been working without deciding to, toward the same quality of penmanship Edmund had maintained, as though the form of the record was as important as its content. She added the final column. The farm was not merely solvent. It was not merely stable, not merely surviving the season that everyone in the valley had predicted would be its last. The farm was free. The mortgage payment Prescott had discussed with such careful gentleness in March was retired, the full outstanding balance cleared from a single season's combined income. The debt that Edmund had carried for the last 11 years of his life, the weight that had set his jaw each evening over the mail, was gone. The land was hers without condition. The per-acre income from the 30 Whitfield acres had exceeded that of the Sutton Farm's 90 acres. It had exceeded the Aldridge operation's 100 acres. Farms 3 times her size, run by men with 30 more years of experience, had been out-earned per acre by a 25-year-old woman who had traded a machine for a living system and spent the spring learning to listen. She sat with that for a while, not with triumph. Triumph felt like the wrong register for what she was feeling. Something quieter. The satisfaction of a proof completed of a question answered that had been running for 30 years before she arrived at the desk to finish it. She turned to the back of the journal, past her father's last entry, past the pages she had been filling through the season. She found the final blank page. She held her pen above it for a moment, the way Edmund had always held his pen. Before beginning an entry, she had seen him do it throughout her childhood, without understanding that it was a ritual, a small act of intention before committing observation to record. She wrote the date. She wrote the final figures in their columns the way a good record deserves to be closed. Then below the numbers, she wrote 4 sentences that were not figures, not data, not the objective language of agricultural record keeping. She wrote them for herself, which meant she wrote them for him. October 1971. The farm is free. The bees are home. Dad, you were watching the right corner all along. She closed the journal. She put it in the bottom right drawer of Edmund's desk where the other journals lived. Then she refilled the lamp because there was more work to do before the season was fully closed. Winter preparation for 20 colonies that had earned their place on this land. And she was their steward, and stewardship did not pause to celebrate itself. It was the summer of 2001 when Nora first put her hands on a hive. She was 10 years old, the daughter of Clara's son Everett, and she had been asking to come out to the apiary with her grandmother for 2 years. Clara had made her wait not from reluctance, but from the knowledge written in Gus Mabry's hand in a notebook that now lived in the same desk drawer as Edmund's journals. That readiness was a specific thing, not a function of age or eagerness. When Nora showed up on a June morning, having read unprompted the 2 library books on beekeeping that Clara had left on the kitchen table 6 months earlier, without suggesting she read them, Clara judged that readiness had arrived. The farm in 2001 was a different place in its particulars, but recognizable in its character. 30 acres of blueberry, the same as always, but the rows now interspersed with wildflower strips that had been establishing and reseeding and deepening for 20 years. 4 apiaries expanded from the original 2 positions, each one a permanent installation, now with permanent windbreaks, permanent water sources, the whole infrastructure of long-term habitat rather than seasonal placement. No pesticides in 3 decades. Not a decision Clara had announced or publicized, but a practice that had grown naturally from the logic of the system. You don't build a pollinator partnership with one hand while poisoning pollinators with the other. The native bees from the timber had long since extended their range across the full property, the mason bees nesting in the wooden blocks she had installed along the south-facing fence lines, the bumblebees working the deeper parts of the wildflower strips that the honeybees ignored. The farm was not the largest operation in the valley. She had never tried to make it the largest. It was the most productive per acre it had ever been by a margin that had continued to compound as the soil biology responded to 3 decades of chemical-free management, as the diversity of pollinators deepened and stabilized, as the whole system that she had begun building in the spring of 1971 accumulated the interest on its own investment. The blueberries were better now than they had been in 1971, not because she had worked harder or spent more, because the system had been running long enough to become self-reinforcing. Nora stood beside her in the southwest apiary, already dressed in the small white suit Clara had ordered from the same supplier she had used since 1974. Her dark hair tucked up into the veil with the careful thoroughness of a child who has thought about this task. She held the smoker with the focused attention of someone performing a procedure rather than helping with a chore. Clara lifted a frame from the nearest hive with the unhurried deliberateness she had been practicing for 30 years. The frame was heavy-capped honey covering most of its surface, the hexagonal cells sealed with the pale wax that meant the moisture content was right, the honey ready. She held it up in the morning light and the capped cells caught the sun the way they always did. The way they had caught the light in Gus Mabry's hands 30 years ago, when he had shown her what a productive hive looked like before she had known what she was looking at. You see that? Clara turned the frame so Nora could see the full face of it. The girl's eyes were wide inside the veil, taking in the weight of it, the density of the capping, the bees moving on the surface of the comb with their complete unconcern. That's not just food. That's proof that the land keeps its promises when you keep yours first. Nora looked at the frame for a long moment. Then she looked up at her grandmother with the serious eyes that Everett had inherited from Clara and apparently passed on. Were you scared, Grandma, when everyone said you were wrong? Clara held the frame steady. She looked at it rather than at Nora while she found the honest answer, the one that didn't simplify in either direction. Every single night. But the bees weren't scared. She paused, looking at the calm, purposeful movement on the frame's surface. So I followed their lead. She set the frame back into the hive with the careful deliberateness of long practice. Nora watched her do it, watching the motion of it, the angle of entry, the way Clara's hands released the frame with the last inch done slowly. She was memorizing the technique with the unself-conscious attention of someone who fully intends to do this herself, who has already accepted that this knowledge is hers to inherit. Clara replaced the cover. She stood back from the hive and looked at her granddaughter in the morning light, 10 years old, serious-eyed, holding a smoker with the careful grip of someone who understood that the things worth doing required the things worth doing carefully. She was inheriting more than technique. She was inheriting the understanding that lay behind the technique, the 30 years of accumulated knowledge that had begun with Edmund's journals and a night at a desk, in a pattern that 3 generations of careful observers had recorded without interpreting. She was inheriting a way of looking. Nora reached out and placed one gloved hand against the side of the hive Clara had just closed. She had seen her grandmother do this, had seen the gesture of contact repeated enough times to understand that it was not random. She held her hand there. Clara watched her go still, the way you go still when you are trying to hear something small beneath something loud. The vibration moved through the wood and through the glove and into the girl's palm. Clara saw the moment it registered in Nora's face, the small, involuntary change of expression that comes when something outside you confirms something you have been hoping was true. The colony breathed its steady breath through the wood, alive, purposeful, committed to its work. They're not scared either, Nora said. She said it with the quiet certainty of a direct report. Clara looked at her granddaughter's hand on the hive, the morning light falling across the white suit, the southwest corner rising behind them with its 30 years of deep soil and accumulated trust. The timber stood at the western edge, unchanged, the native bees already moving through the understory in the early warmth. The blueberry rows ran their orderly lines in every direction, holding their summer green the fruit weeks from ripening, but already committed to the process. The valley spread out beyond the fence lines in its summer abundance, and somewhere on its far roads, a version of every doubt she had carried through the spring of 1971 was still circulating, still finding new hosts, still convincing sensible people that the conventional answer was the only answer. She could not correct all of it. She could only tend what was hers to tend, which was this land, these bees, this girl who had just learned to listen through wood. The experts of the Willamette Valley had known how to rent bees. Clara Whitfield had learned how to earn them. 30 years of evidence stood in every direction around her, rooted in the dark Oregon soil, vibrating with the specific frequency of things that have been given what they actually need. The land remembered. The land always remembered. She put her hand on the hive beside her granddaughter's, and the two of them stood in the morning of a summer that already knew what it was doing, listening to the thing that had been running beneath the noise of the world all along, steady as a pulse, patient as soil, indifferent to everything except the quality of the partnership it had been offered.